This is Bob Weisel. I'm with Dan Crowley. This is the second take. Dan is a World War II veteran of the Philippines and was a prisoner of war for over 3 years by the Japanese. We left off with Dan just getting out of Japan and flying in a battered C-54 to Manila, and we're going to continue from there and then catch up later on some other things. So you got to Manila.
Yeah, but didn't you want to go back to Palawan first?
We can do that. Let's do that.
Let's go back to Palawan, because that was probably the nightmare, the worst nightmare, for 18 months of my incarceration. And it was the site of the most infamous massacre the Japanese did to Americans in one spot, where they burned roughly 146 fellows alive with gasoline. But how did we get there? We were in this Cabanatuan, which I mentioned, after the surrender of Corregidor, and we were slaves on a farm operation there, growing food for the Japanese, sweet potatoes, and gave us the vines, which you couldn't digest, even if you chewed them for a year. But anyway, we were told that if you want to get out of this place, we've got another spot you might like better. It's a much improved version and better food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Massive baloney. And they asked for volunteers to go out. It sounded so great, a bunch of us volunteered. So several hundred were sent to Manila from Cabanatuan to board a ship to Palawan. And it wasn't as bad as the hell ships that brought us to Japan, because we weren't packed down in the holes with the threat of being torpedoed any moment, or no air. They wanted to make a great gesture to build us up to this marvelous vacation we were going to take on the island of Palawan. We had no idea where we were, of course, or where Palawan was at all. And Palawan is, for all you modern folks, due east of Vietnam, Cambodia, not too far. It's the long, 100-odd mile long, narrow, cigar-shaped island southwest of Luzon in the Philippine group. So anyway, we arrive in Palawan, and they marched us up from the dock to an ancient Filipino training camp, which was similar to a National Guard wooden barracks, with a strange medieval-looking towers in front out of stone, which was the entrance. So we didn't know what the hell this was going to be all about. But we found out fast it wasn't a paradise, because the next morning we got on trucks, and they were American trucks the Japanese captured, of course. And we were driven to the west side of the island, which was heavy jungle and also banana plantations and coconut plantations. And we were to carve an airstrip out of primeval jungle in most cases, using picks and shovels and saws and axes. No power saws, of course, and no power equipment, manual. So after we took the trees down and cleared an area large enough for a minimal airstrip, then we had to level it and fill it with support. So we mined the coral rock, and we had to go farther and farther every day, loading mining cars, the V-shaped, old-fashioned mining car. So digging the coral was in itself a brutal experience, because we had no clothing. We were covered with a loincloth. The heat was intense, well over 100 average, near the equator. And we, barefooted and barehanded, with primitive picks and shovels, dug out the coral and loaded the cars, and as it grew farther and farther in distance for the rail track that we had to lay, the weight of the cars seemed to get heavier and heavier, but we had 2 Jap guards to each car with 4-foot clubs, which were about 2 inches thick, which we called vitamin sticks, because when we had the cars heaped with the coral, it seemed impossible, because we were starved skeletons at that point. But with the clubs, we gained enough strength to push the loads to where the airstrip was and spread them. After spreading the support for the runway, we had to tamp it down with blocks, physically, manually. So if you could picture building the base of a modern airfield, on coral to form the support base for the airstrip. Everything was manual. The only thing with power were the trucks that they confiscated from the surrendered American forces. And the drivers were Americans they recruited who would rather drive a truck, of course. And the Japs didn't even know how to drive a truck. And they had never seen a dump truck. So one day when a fellow was elevating the dump truck, a lieutenant in charge with his sword thought he was breaking the truck and he wanted to chop his head off. They had a hell of a time explaining in time what a dump truck was. If you could picture this. This was an agrarian society previous to the great buildup for the war, so they were out of the primitive eras of the Middle Ages in some cases. So anyway, to go on, the next step was the concrete. So I caught these wonderful details, and after tamping the rock, digging it and tamping it, then I was assigned to unloading the cement ship. And 2 of us were placed in the hold of the cement ship, which was filled with, I believe they were 100-pound bags of dry cement. And we would toss them into the net, a huge woven net, which was dropped down by a cable, and we'd fill the net up with cement bags, and they'd pull it up out of the hold and drop it on the dock to go onto the trucks. The air was so thick with cement dust that when we came out of the hold at the end of our shift, we were coated with cement, and perspiration hardened it, of course. And we were allowed to jump off the dock into the water, which was infested with jellyfish. That I could never forget, to wash off. So the combination of the salt water, the cement, the irritation to the whole body was unbelievable. Anyway, finished unloading the cement ship detail. Then I got on the cement mixing detail. How I caught them all, I have no idea. This was non-voluntary. And how we mixed the cement was totally primitive. We put sheets of galvanized metal, poured the cement on it, and the sand, made a groove and poured the water in, and then 4 men on each side would turn it to mix it. When we got it up to a proper consistency, we would fill in the forms which we constructed. This was similar to pouring, only it's done totally mechanically, a highway. Only this was all manual.
How many feet?
I've forgotten. I think it was about 8 or 10 inches.
No, I mean, how many feet long was
The runway?
Yeah.
It was just enough to get a propeller plane in the air of their vintage.
So it was
No surplus.
Around 1,000 feet.
Well, I think it was more than that. Probably around, I don't know, 1,500. I'm not sure. I gave you the photograph of it on the west side of Palawan from Puerto Princesa, the capital.
Yep.
That's the road we would go down from Puerto Princesa. So we eventually got the entire strip poured, and the first plane to land, to take off, was a plane which came in to pick up our dearly beloved Japanese commander, Kishimoto-san. And Kishimoto was a character that many people have seen in countless films of Japanese and wartime, where they would get on a box and bellow their speech. And he did it each morning when we were lined up to go to work. And he would get up in his box at the head of the field, next to his confiscated home, which was some Filipino businessman's home, I guess, pre-war. And he would bellow, "My honorable warriors, you must work hard today, because you must save your money, and we will pay you if you work hard only. And this will help your families when you go home, which won't be very long, because we are conquering the west coast of the United States now. We are landing in California." And he believed it. I sincerely believe he believed what he was saying. He was fed the garbage from Tokyo. So we had to line up on the airstrip to watch our dearly beloved commander take off in this tail-skid, two-passenger light plane, and the skid ripped a nice hole in the concrete because we had thoughtfully sabotaged the mix as often as we could, overloading it with sand as many times as we could. So we made a very defective concrete strip. Eventually, when the Americans did land there, I believe it was a Marine squadron, they had to put steel mats down before they could land a modern aircraft. But when the strip was almost totally finished, this was just after I was sent out before it was finished with a group of unable to work fellas who were proclaimed by our doctor Broody. No, not Broody, sorry, Mango. Dr. Mango was our doctor, American doctor. And he was, to say the least, not loved by the prisoners, who hoped he would declare them unfit for labor when he held sick call each morning. I was chosen as one of those unfit to labor, primarily because of my mental state. I looked the part. I have no photograph, but it must have been a frightening sight. Beard hanging down about a foot, and the hair over my shoulders burnt black, and my ribs sticking out. Anyway, he thought I was worse off than most of them. And the other fellows were mostly broken-arm cases who had had their arms shattered by a fellow from Long Island who we called Jerry the Executioner. He would smash your arm with a steel bar he found for 10 cigarettes. You would put your arm on a wooden stump at the rear of this sleeping barracks, down a steep staircase. At the foot of it was the entrance to the concrete benjo, where you did your urinating and pooping. And when the fellow had his arm smashed, he would report to the guard, because the guard stood at the bottom of the stairs, and you had to ask his permission to pass, to go and do your business. And you'd say, Benjo deska, so-and-so. And he'd say, Benjo deska. But on your way back, if you had your arm smashed, you had to report you fell in the benjo. And Captain Kishimoto got rather fed up with too many men reporting unable to work because of their shattered arm from falling in the benjo. So he made a great speech one morning that you must stop falling in benjo. The greater East prosperity sphere needs your labor. we need you. Now, how many of those poor bastards survived who had their arms shattered with no medical attention? No one ever knew. No one knows to this day, probably. Whatever happened to Jerry the executioner, I never did hear if he made it out alive. But I got out in a small boat with a handful of these cases who had shattered arms, and the Jap officer on the boat, it was opened. We made it from Puerto Princesa, Palawan, back to Manila in this open boat. And it didn't take as long because it was faster than the freighter. But he thought I was very clever for getting on the boat. And he understood everything we said. I found out he went to an American school in California, but he was nice enough not to send me back to Palawan. So anyway, back to Palawan, back to Manila. Meanwhile, the rest of the fellows went out in one large shipment back to Manila after I left. Then there were approximately 150 left. And at this point, the Japanese commander would say every day, we are worried about air raids. The Americans are bombing, and they may come any morning. So he had the guys practice getting down in the holes in the ground, covered with timbers and earth on top of that, and they were called air raid shelters. They were just trenches dug in the ground. And after repeated false alarms, the final stroke was when he packed them down in these holes and had his men pour gasoline into the openings and throw a torch in and ignite it. And there was a photograph taken by the Japs of men coming out in flames, and one of them was Dr. Mango, the doctor who had kindly labeled me unable to work, so I owe my life to Dr. Mango. And the other officer was Captain Bruni of the Tank Corps, who was our commanding officer. And they had treated him brutally. One day he went over to the commander's house to protest the lack of food and medical care, and he had his men beat him to an absolute pulp, and two of them dragged him back and threw him inside the compound on his face. This is the United States Army captain commander of the American prisoners. That's how brutal they were. They didn't give a damn who you were. So I went back to Manila, incarcerated in what is called Bilibid prison. It was the civilian prison pre-war, built actually by the Spaniards with thick concrete walls, very high, right in the center of Manila. And this was called a hospital. So they had sick wards there for the dying, and the American naval doctors did what they could. The only medication they had was called Jensen's Violet, which is used to this day to paint the horribly infected legs. I have only a few remaining scars from the rot, but some men had the entire leg rotted off. And from there, we were sent up to Cabanatuan again. So here I am back home at the largest camp where I was first incarcerated. Next call, and I forget how long the interval was, we were going to Manila to board another ship to go to Japan. So luckily I got out of there on one of the early ships that left Manila before the American submarines were torpedoing the other slave ships and dive bombing them at the end. So I made it to Japan. I think I covered that where I landed. Yeah. Now flash forward. Where do you want me?
Well, you left off with August 14th.
Yeah.
You got a day off.
Yes.
From work, and then you went from there to you were there for several weeks. Then you got on a C-54.
First we were deloused on the dock.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you went to Atsugi, I think.
Atsugi, after being deloused.
And then, after a period of time, they sent in C-54s, and you...
Well, they were there.
They were there.
When we were sent up from the docks to the airstrip, they were trying to get us out in a hurry because they were afraid we might touch a Japanese because of our previous treatment. And MacArthur was terrified of any incidents that might develop. At that point, he wanted their total love and respect and subservience. He became the Emperor of Japan, in effect. So, as I mentioned, my C-54 lost 2 engines on the way, and it was quite a frightening experience listening to the 2 props being feathered, and the crew chief aboard wasn't quite sure we'd make it, but he said, I sure hope so. And we made it, and we had these surplus, bags of cigarettes the Red Cross girls had given us, and we were giving them to the CBs lining the airstrip in Okinawa. Then we boarded, and I guess it was the same plane when they refueled it and flew on to Manila, where they packed us into a tent city to await a shipment back to the States. Again, several weeks went by, and we left sometime in October, as I recall. It was a long, slow voyage.
When did you reach the States?
I believe it was late October or early November, I'm not sure. Those dates I've forgotten almost completely, yeah. We were sent to Letterman General Hospital for observation in San Francisco at the Presidio. That was the main military hospital in the West Coast, yeah.
And you were there for how long?
Oh, I believe it was about 10 days for observation. Yeah. We weren't allowed to go into town, so we'd get a taxi and go into our pajamas. We weren't issued any clothing. So we had more damn fun going to the fanciest bars in San Francisco in our pajamas. And they didn't bat an eye. They didn't charge us either.
They knew you were former
yeah.
POWs.
Yeah.
So when
they were more decent than the U.S. Army, because the U.S. Army wouldn't buy us a beer while we waited for the ship in Manila in those tents. We could draw against our back pay, and the maximum back pay, I believe, had gone up to $40 a month. But I had a withdrawal that my poor mother took every month out of desperation, because my brothers had almost abandoned her as far as support. So she drew a small amount every month from my pay. So my back pay didn't accumulate too large. It wouldn't have been very large anyway, based on the amount they were paying. And no one would believe what we were paid. But we got on a train finally in Oakland, a hospital train. And we had a commandor who could be a stand-in for Major Frank Burns of MASH. He was the exact same type. He was in the medical corps, but I don't think he was a doctor. And he had a major's insignia. But he bellowed out before we pulled out of the yard in Oakland that if I catch any man with any alcohol on this train, I'll throw him off. I don't care if it's the middle of the desert. That was quite a greeting for ex-prisoner of the Japs. Of course, 2 of us had a suitcase rather full, and we had the nurses hide it so that he couldn't find it. And we had a party all the way to Chicago with the nurses, which was fun. I'll never forget. That was a pleasant experience. When we got to Chicago, they dumped us off the train without any ceremony, and we were on our own with tickets to New York, the guys from the East Coast. So we wound up, are you okay? Okay. We wound up in New York. I forget how long the train was then from Chicago to New York, probably 24 hours. Then I caught a train from Grand Central to my town in Greenwich, Connecticut. And I got in after dark, I remember. It was rather late at night. and walked up the avenue. It was a long uphill climb, and knocked on my mother's apartment door and said, "Hi, I'm home, Mom." That was it, yep.
Wow.
Next visit was the local pub that was most popular. She let me go because she understood. And I walked in the door, and here were all these fellows who knew me, and they couldn't get over it.
They probably assumed you were dead.
Oh, yeah, yep, yep. And one fellow turned out to have been married one of my wife's cousins, and he was shot in the ass in Anzio, pardon me, hit with shrapnel. He was leaning out of his tank on the beach at Anzio. So he showed everyone his wound after several drinks by dropping his trousers. And he bought me multiple drinks at the bar. I'll never forget that. When you were young, that was it. Yeah.
So then you mustered out at that point?
No. We had the 5220 club at that point. What did they call it? Well, our nickname was the 5220 Club. You got $20 a week for 52 weeks to readjust. That was the readjustment period. You never
Was provided for all POWs?
Yeah.
Okay.
5220. Finally, it was time to get discharged, and I went up to Fort Devens in my Model A Ford that I purchased with some of my huge fortune that I had. And at Fort Devens, they gave me my final balance of my back pay. And as I recall, it was a little over $300. That was 4 years from the date of the beginning of our involvement in war, December 8th, until April 4th of 46. But it wasn't 400, it was under 400.
So that was April 4th was your discharge date?
Right.
Okay.
Fort Devens. Then you're on your own, as you know, yeah, with a ruptured duck.
Yeah. What did you do after that?
What did I do? I took my readjustment. Most of us did.
I mean, where did you work after you got out of the...
Oh, I finally got a job. I had to go back to work, and some fellow was hiring ex-military people to tear down worker housing in Hartford. I heard about it, and it was high pay. It was something like 20 a week. It sounded very tempting. So we went up to Hartford, and we slept in some of these shacks that they had built for the factory workers during World War II. It was somewhere near Brainerd Field, in the heart of Hartford. And we were knocking them down with crowbars and hammers. And it was flimsy crap, of course. But they were rebuilding them in Greenwich on the Mianus River as housing for the veterans, anything for the veterans. Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, there was a lot of benevolency then, anything for the veterans. Yeah.
Did you use the GI Bill to go to college after you got...
I tried it one night, New York U, and it appeared so juvenile. The fellow who was the professor appeared to resemble someone in a grammar school, or at best a high school freshman, and his ability to communicate was so bad, and it was so uninspiring, I never bothered to go back, period. So that was the extent of my GI Bill use. I saved our country a lot of money.
Did you, what work did you do on a permanent basis then?
Permanent?
Yeah.
My brother had a friend in the jewelry business, and my brother told him he may not know much, but he'll work his ass off. So he hired me on a straight commission basis to sell junk jewelry to people who'd never heard of it and didn't want it, through the jewelers of part of New York State and part of New England. So that was a learning experience on its own. I'd already had a master's in airfield construction and a doctorate in deep rock mining, so I was way ahead of the game. At this point, I was now getting an advanced degree in selling and psychological maneuvering to try to get them to buy something they didn't want. And the worst part of that whole episode was when he gave me a magnificent territory as a reward for my hard work, all of New England, including the great cities of Maine, Devon, New Hampshire. Of course, there weren't any great cities. And I was paying my own way, and he would give me a small drawing account, and from that, I had to pay all my expenses and survive. So I called my bride-to-be, who I had met on another sojourn up Greenwich Avenue, this time in my first vehicle, which I was sold by a local Ford dealer who had told me previously that he didn't have any cars because, I found out, he was selling them to South America. Because by chance, I met the drivers on a commuting ride to New York to talk about my new job as a salesman. And these fellas told me what they were doing. They were coming out to Greenwich to pick up cars at the dealership owned by a vice president of Standard Oil in New Jersey, a multimillionaire, I guess. And this was just one of his side investments. He was a friend of the Fords and the Firestones, etc. So he was given an unlimited allotment of Fords, whereas other dealers got a meager number. But he had a great market for them. He was dumping them in South America for about 8 times what they would sell for here. He didn't have enough money, you see, the poor man. So they refused to sell me one. And then I called one of my old employers, who I had worked for when I was 16, pumping gasoline. And she was married to a man who was a powerhouse in the Republican Party. And he conveyed the thought to the dealership owner that this fellow deserves a car, find him one. So I got a call then from the manager of the dealership, Otto Klump. And Otto said, "Dad, I've got great news for you. I found you a car." So I got my brand new Ford Business Coupe, which was the thing everyone wanted in those days when you were traveling. And I think it was $800 for a brand new business coupe. Of course, that was a fortune in those days. Yep, yep. So I called the bride from the icebox of Vermont and told her I was cold as hell and I think we ought to get married and get ready. So I came down to Greenwich. I said, "I'll be home." I think it was Friday. "Get ready, we'll get married." And we went to I had to go into New York to get an advance on my future commissions. And the boss was very upset that I wasn't in the territory. So I told him why, and he graciously gave me $50 to go back into the territory with my new bride. So we spent that first freezing winter of '47. She sat in the car and froze with no heater. Well, I made my calls trying to convince these people to buy something they didn't want. And we had no house or home. My brother in Vermont, who was working in northern Vermont, finally found a rental for me from the landlord that he rented from. So we found a place to live in Brattleboro, Vermont, for $40 a month. So that was our first home. And I had to drive from there as far as Bangor, Maine, and home because I couldn't afford to stay over. And the gasoline was cheaper than staying over and eating. Of course, they got very upset when they started paying a small gasoline allowance that I was using so much. And I had to explain in a multiple-page letter why I drove round trip. So I got an answer from the sales manager saying, your recent safari to Bangor, Maine is acknowledged, and I understand. So there you are. I finally gave up that, and
now you mentioned in the first take that after the war the VA treated you very shabbily.
well, they didn't know. They had informed their people about nothing. Should I say they didn't inform their employees about our status at all, what we'd been through. So you couldn't blame either the local peons in the clerk category or even the managers of your local VA offices. They didn't know any better. So we were living in Brattleboro at that time, as I mentioned, and my dysentery started reoccurring, and it was serious enough that it frightened me because I was afraid of infecting our new baby, who was born in '48. So I drove to White River Junction to the VA hospital, and they were very nasty to me. They did their damnedest to just prove that I wasn't entitled to anything.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, period. Yeah. Neither my health nor my status in the military gave me any right to being taken care of by the VA. So I went back with my tail between my legs, because you really don't know what to do at that point when you're in your 20s. And how old was I? I was 25 then. But remember, I had lost 4 years of my life, so I was really a 21-year-old without any advanced education. So my next episode was in Hartford, at the Letterman General Hospital. They had a dental ward with God knows how many chairs. In my memory, it was a vast room, and all you could hear were teeth clattering on the floor as they were extracted. They were working on the POWs there. And I remember telling them I didn't want them pulled, so just leave me alone. And after an exam, they sent me out, and I lived with it until 50, when I was told by a civilian dentist how bad it was. Then I went back to see if I could get any help from the VA in Hartford. The headquarters then was on Pearl Street. And they told me bluntly, we don't know anything about that, so we can't do a thing for you. After 64 years, she's still a good woman there. So that was the second impression I got of a grateful nation. Not to be sarcastic, but...
Did you suffer what today is called post-traumatic stress?
I guess I've suffered it ever since. I relive it daily. When it rains, as it does today, I remember the good days at Palawan. We would line up every morning to get on the trucks, and we prayed for rain. We sang a little song. So you see, we'll pray to dear old JC to send us Taksan Ami, and there'll be no Shigoto. Lots of rain, no work, because the guards weren't forced to work in the rain guarding us. So that gave us a day off. Then we had to make it up, of course, the next day by working twice as hard. If you were loading 25 cars this day, then it was 30 cars the next day. And they must have gotten that education from the gulags of Stalin, because they practiced the same carrot-the-stick routine there, if you recall your history. Today, you must load 20 cars and you may quit work. Tomorrow it was 22 and 23 and so on and so forth. And the poor saps, the Americans with no brains at all, would go along with it. They'd work hard, and they'd turn to their fellow man and say, get your arse moving. We've got to get these cars filled so we can quit. They just couldn't seem to realize until it was too late, when you couldn't fill those extra tray of cars. But unfortunately, we'll always have poor fools like that.
Do you suffer any nightmares? Did you
Oh.
suffer nightmares? Under the heading of silly questions.
Right. The other thing that reminds me daily is when it's hot, and I'm reliving Palawan, the burning heat, and then when the snows come, I'm trudging through the snows at Ashio to the Minehead, the winter of '44, when the snows got deep up to our waist, and we were walking through it barefoot in cotton uniforms to board the cage to go down to the 2,000-foot level. Yeah.
Well, Dan, I'd like to thank you and say that I wish you had not had to go through what you went through. I know one other question I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
How do you think you survived when so many others didn't? I mean, were you particularly religious? Did you have a religious faith, or was it dumb?
I didn't know what religion was, frankly.
Okay.
My father told the priests a long time ago, when they would call to wonder why those boys aren't in church, he would say, "You're not going to get my boys." He must have had a advance warning that something might happen to children who were put in the hands of deviants, because the priesthood was filled with deviants, as we know now. It was a shelter for them. Yeah.
But was it, you just had a positive attitude? If you had to say...
Well, I was determined to live, always, at the bottom. I was going to overcome this. I wasn't going to let them get me, and I had a burning hate of the bastards. So I was interviewed, Bob, by, was it CBS or NBC? CBS in St. Louis, when we were having a reunion to commemorate the massacre at Palawan. And the reporter called me from the station, Channel 4 of St. Louis, and asked to come and interview me. And he had a photographer operating the camera who was from Israel, who was getting a tremendous charge out of listening to me, because he thought he was hearing about the other Holocaust that he had never heard of. So the reporter was great. I'll never forget it. He videoed me for at least a half hour, and my final statement was, someday the bastards are going to pay for what they did to us. And the station allowed every word to go on the air. They did not edit one item out of it, including the bastards are going to pay. But I could never get a copy of the tape. I tried my darndest, but they were reusing tapes in those days. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you.
Someday the bastards are going to pay, but I don't know where. We didn't get to that part about them. What happened to them, the guards?
Oh.
Want to cover that?
Sure, let's talk about it.
Okay.
I've got some time.
Great.
Now, these are the guards that were...
Well, everywhere, but think about the guards at Palawan who were members of an Air Force, this is Japanese Air Force, Labor Battalion Airfield Construction, such as our Seabees, our naval construction battalions. That's who they were. Now, the fellow from Simsbury who read about me, who was the American officer to land with the first Americans at Palawan, and they had heard from the Filipinos of the massacre, and he described the landing in Palawan and being told where the Japanese were who had done this deed. And he said, quote, "We hunted them down and gave them a trial and hung them." Well, it was all baloney, because they didn't find them, his group, and they didn't hunt them down. They didn't hang them. The Japanese guards who perpetrated all of these foul deeds, including the Palawan massacre, where they burned the Americans alive, were all found out. And the majority, except for a just a handful who, with the help of family and friends, escaped into the mountains to get away from the American occupation forces and were hiding all those years in the mountains from the time of our occupation beginning until our infamous peace treaty agreement in San Francisco, which was 51, about 6 years. So these people were all put on trial, and in most cases, the evidence was overwhelming enough, so they were found guilty either of outright murder and sentenced to death or long prison terms. And they had a prison in Tokyo called Sugamo, packed with the guilty who faced execution or long prison terms. But the dear Sappos who run our affairs at the highest level thought that mercy was in order, and we must give them absolute, what's the word I'm thinking of, where we will not follow through on our
You have to pardon them?
Yeah, we will pardon them all because of we graciously are bestowing our mercy or some such garbage to absolve them. That's the word I was trying to find, of all guilt. So they turned the Sugamo prisoners loose. Class A murderers, in most cases, were turned loose. Vicious thugs in the most minor cases, who took great delight in practicing brutality towards the helpless American prisoners. The famous statement by the Japanese commander at the beginning at Camp O'Donnell, where the men were dying like flies, where 26,000 Filipinos, mostly Filipinos, and Americans died in only 6 weeks out of 100,000. That was about 80,000 Filipinos that were there, or 85,000, I forget. Majority were Filipinos. But the disease was spreading into the Japanese ranks. And the American commander begged for mercy, and the Japanese commander said, "I cannot give you any mercy. I want you all to die." That was shortly before he was forced to shut it down because he was terrified that it was going to infect his own men and possibly himself. But that was their attitude, that we were not human beings anymore. We were to be treated as the lowest form of life, lower than the native prisoners. So, our kind and benevolent State Department boys who negotiated the treaty be damned, I say, but they passed it in 51 because they wanted to use Japan as a bulwark against the evil communism, the same as they used the nastiest of the Germans and brought them here, I believe, about 25,000 from Germany, who were rewarded for aiding our effort to defend our world against communism, the ugly specter. So who do you get in bed with? We backed up Chiang Kai-shek in China against the nasty communists who were trying to save their people from the horrors of being under a dictator like Chiang Kai-shek. The Marines who were stationed in Shanghai, the 4th Marine Corps, would tell me how they found the streets filled with bodies every day. They had special details come up and pick up the bodies from the dead Chinese from starvation and disease, just lying all over the streets of Shanghai. That's how bad it was under Chiang Kai-shek. But we backed him, and we lost China. We backed the Shah, we lost Iran. We've backed the nastiest of the nasty in many cases. Who does it? How these so-called educated men could perform these asinine mistakes and get our country in such trouble. Then the worst incident was when we drove the Japanese out of the southern Pacific and out of Indochina, which is now Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and when we freed them, the people, from the totalitarian rule of the Japanese, and then turned them back over to the French, who had colonized them and wanted to continue colonizing them. So we backed the French. And we know the story, most people know it, of Ding Ben Phu. Is that the proper pronunciation?
Dien Bien Phu.
Dien Bien Phu, yeah. Where the French finally were taught a lesson and were overwhelmed by the Vietnamese fighters. They were masters at strategy, and they won. But if we'd befriended the leaders of the Vietnamese communists at the beginning, sympathized with them and showed them, we're with you, instead of fighting them and giving the totalitarian dictators the right to rule people, that cost us 10 years of war in Vietnam and countless hundreds of thousands, I believe it was over 1 million or more civilians.
Yes.
And Americans in huge numbers.
57,000 Americans killed.
But that was just deaths.
Yeah.
As it is today, the severely wounded far outweighed the dead. And the broken in mental, the mental breakdowns as a result of it. The destruction of our society long term, which is, it's eroded to this day. So no wonder we engender so much hatred in the world with stupid morons who are elected to high place and are appointed to high places to defend the rights of our people and supposedly the rights of the downtrodden everywhere in the world. There we are.
There we are.
Someone always pays the price of ignorance. We paid it. I didn't mention, I'm sorry, one of the nastiest incidents in our history was when Roosevelt asked his advisors, how can we break through to save the men of Bataan and bring them reinforcements? And Stimson and the others stated bluntly, we can't do it. We have to abandon the Philippines. There's no way we can do it. And I believe it was Stimson who stated, there's a time when men must die. Of course, he said that in Washington. He wasn't saying it in Bataan or in Corregidor or in a Japanese slave labor camp. So
that sounds like a good place to leave it, Dan.
there we are.
There we are.
There we are.
You did a great job.
Where else can we be?